Well, thank you very much for your introduction. And I'd also like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me here. Some of you may recall I was here a few years ago to give a keynote address at this conference. And it was on a similar topic, but based on an earlier stage in my thinking and my progression towards assessment use argument. So I wanted to thank the conference organizers for inviting me again. I'm very surprised. I guess you liked the first time enough to invite me back. Today I'm going to talk about a new approach to classroom-based language assessment. And this is based on a book that my wife, Barbara Dombach, and I published with Oxford last year. Some of the topics that I'll be talking about include the importance of classroom-based language assessments, teachers' language assessment needs, the role of assessment in teaching, using classroom-based assessments, accountability in assessment, assessment justification, the assessment use argument, and then I'll talk a little bit about the practical application of these things in developing classroom-based language assessments, and we'll talk about creating multiple assessment tasks. So let's talk about the importance of classroom language assessments. We typically think that large-scale language assessments are the most important. They're the ones that get all the publicity there, they're the ones that get all the recognition, they're the ones that people are most concerned about. However, in terms of sheer numbers, each year more students are affected by decisions based on classroom-based language assessments than by those made on the basis of largest scale assessments. So consider, how many language learners are there worldwide? How many language learners are there worldwide? Well, if you look at various reports from UNESCO, from the World Bank, OECD, the British Council, you can see that there are almost 2 billion foreign language learners around the world studying languages in classrooms, okay? How many classroom-based assessments are used in these classes each year? Well, the average school year is at 210 days, which makes 42 weeks, and if you say that teachers assess every 3 weeks even, that would be 14 assessments per year in every class. How many decisions are made on the basis of these assessments? Every time a teacher gives an assessment, that teacher uses that assessment information to make some decisions, and we're going to talk about those later this morning. Well, there are 14 decisions on each test times 2 billion, that's 28 billion decisions per year are made on the basis of classroom assessments. Even the largest large-scale assessments in China, which are up to around 20 million now, do not come close to this. Many of the decisions that are made on the basis of these classroom assessments are medium to high stakes. Thus, it's essential that classroom teachers have the knowledge and skills to enable them to develop and use classroom-based language assessments. It's essential for them. Some research suggests that teachers spend almost 50% of their time assessing their students. Nevertheless, classroom teachers typically receive very little, if any, training in classroom assessment as part of their pre-service education or as part of in-service training programs. And furthermore, many of the courses in language assessment that are offered focus on issues and procedures that are relevant to large-scale assessments rather than helping teachers develop and use classroom assessments. So what I'd like to talk about is a new approach. The current approach to training teachers about large-scale assessment is, in our view, not appropriate, not helpful, and so we've developed a new approach. And I'll follow the approach to classroom-based assessment that my wife and I published in our book, Language Assessment of Classroom Teachers. My wife is a former elementary school teacher. She was an elementary school principal. She was a teacher trainer in Germany for many years. And we have been conducting workshops for classroom teachers around the world for the past 3 or 4 years. And every time we gave a workshop, we heard the same concerns from teachers. And the information, the approach we presented was always received very positively by the teachers in the workshops. And so we felt that we wanted to publish a book to make our ideas more widely available. And so what I'm going to present this morning is basically based on our book. So I want to give credit to my wife also for the content of this presentation. This approach to assessment development is aimed at enabling classroom teachers to acquire the knowledge and skills they need to develop and use classroom-based assessments. This approach to assessment development promotes interaction between classroom teachers, between students, between fellow teachers, and other stakeholders, parents, school officials, and so on. It focuses on assessment as an essential part of teaching and learning, not as a large-scale assessment, as an essential part of teaching and learning. And thus, it helps make assessment a positive aspect of teaching and learning. As many of you know, assessment is kind of a dirty word in teaching. It's something that we have to do, we don't feel very comfortable with, our students don't particularly like it. The purpose of this approach is to integrate assessment with teaching so that it becomes a positive experience for both the teacher and the students. I need to walk around a little bit. To understand the role of assessment in classroom teaching, we need to consider the differences between the two. The essential difference is in the purpose of each. So we need to ask a question, why do we teach? And why do we assess? So let's take the first question, why do we teach? Well, the primary purposes of language teaching are, for example, to promote and facilitate language learning. We might also say the purposes are to develop positive attitudes towards the language and culture that the students are learning, or to enhance students' linguistic, cognitive, emotional, and social development. So the purposes of teaching are to promote learning, promote development in the students. Why do we assess? Well, the primary purpose of classroom assessment is to collect information. We collect information about our students' language ability, how much and what they have learned. We've taught them, they spent time in the classroom, and so we assess to collect information about how much they've learned and what they've learned. So let's make a definition. What is a classroom-based language assessment? We define a classroom-based language assessment as an assessment that is developed and are used by classroom teachers, one or more teachers in the classroom. This clearly distinguishes from large-scale assessment. Large-scale assessments are not typically developed by teachers. And often, in many cases, teachers don't use the large-scale assessments because they get no information, they get no feedback, very little feedback. So classroom-based assessment is teacher-based. It's classroom-based and it's developed by teachers and it's used by teachers. So let's talk about the kinds of decisions we need to make in the classroom. These can be described, first of all, according to their purpose. We can talk about formative decisions and we can talk about summative decisions. So formative decisions are aimed at improving instruction and learning. They involve making changes in teaching and or learning activities. They involve providing feedback to students. And they can be made before, during, or after the period of instruction. Summative decisions, on the other hand, are aimed primarily to make decisions about advancement or placement. Okay? And they involve classifying students into groups. pass, not pass, certify, not certify. And these decisions are always made after the process of learning, teaching and learning. We can also characterize decisions on the basis of the relative importance. So here's a table. We could talk about low stakes, I guess it doesn't show. Okay, low stakes, medium stakes, and high stakes. Low stakes, for low stakes tests, they're relatively minor decisions. The teacher might decide to give an assessment, and on the basis of that assessment, decide whether to continue to the next unit of instruction, okay? With high stakes tests, the decisions are major and life-changing. Decisions like university entrance or high school graduation, employment, these are high stakes decisions. Low stakes decisions, the decision errors are easy to correct. If the teacher decides to go on to the next unit of instruction, and on Monday morning, he or she does that, and the teacher finds out that the students hadn't mastered the material, it's very easy for the teacher to go back and review. Easy to correct. And the cost of making the decision error are very low. With high stakes tests, the decision errors are difficult to correct. If someone doesn't get into a university, it's very difficult to go back and change that decision. Now we could talk about modes of classroom assessment. We talk about two different modes of assessment. Talk about the implicit mode and the explicit mode. Oh, something wrong with my clicker here. Okay, the implicit mode. This is sometimes called dynamic assessment, online assessment, or informal assessment. This is instantaneous. It's continuous and cyclical. It's a part of classroom teaching. Students are largely unaware that the assessment is taking place, and it's used primarily for formative decisions. This is the kind of assessment that the teacher does continuously as part of teaching. The teacher asks a question, the student raises their hand, and the teacher calls in the student. Student says something. Teacher has to decide, what am I going to do next? If the student makes a mistake, are they going to correct the mistake? Or are they going to provide a better example? Are they going to ask another student? Are they going to make an explanation? So this is part of ongoing instruction. Explicit assessment mode, on the other hand, is assessment as assessment, sometimes called formal assessment. This is also continuous and cyclical, but it's a separate activity from teaching. And both the teacher and the students know that this activity is an assessment, and it's used primarily for summative decisions. So this is a case where the teacher says, okay, put away your books, we're going to have a quiz. Okay? Teaching is stopped. We're going to stop and have an assessment. Everybody knows assessment, and we're going to use this assessment to collect some information. Okay? Now, our approach to classroom-based assessment deals only with explicit mode of classroom assessment. And the reason for this is not because the implicit mode is not important, but the implicit mode, there's lots and lots of resources for teachers out there on dynamic assessment, informal assessment. This is also typically included as part of teacher training. And this is a kind of assessment that most teachers are very good at. And so we said, we don't think we need to help teachers with this aspect of assessment, but what teachers feel uncomfortable about or insecure about is the formal, explicit mode. So that's what the focus of our book is about. Now let's talk about using language assessment. When we use the classroom assessment, we actually give the assessment. We collect samples of students' language performance. We give them a prompt, or we ask them a question. They say something, they write something, they tick a box, do something. And we arrive at assessment records. And these could be either a score or a verbal description. And then we interpret these records as indicators of students' language ability. So if they get a high score on the test, we say, well, that tells me that they're very good at reading or speaking or whatever. And then we make decisions based on these interpretations. And why do you think we make these decisions? Because we believe that these decisions will lead to beneficial consequences for stakeholders, particularly our students. Okay? So we can illustrate this as a chain of links. We start with students' performance on the assessment task, and on the basis of that, we make an inference. We arrive at an assessment record. We score it, or we provide a verbal description. We may write notes in the margins of an essay that students write, or we may give them verbal feedback as part of a speaking task. And then that then becomes the basis for the next link, and we use that information to arrive at an interpretation about students' language ability. And then we use that interpretation as information that helps us make decisions. And those decisions, we believe, will lead to beneficial consequences. So the process of assessment is a series of inferential links, from performance to scores or records, to interpretations, to decisions, to consequences. And what we find is this is mostly what teachers do. Teachers haven't sort of analyzed it in this particular way. But when you think about your own situation and what you do with the assessments, typically this is what you do also. You give an assessment and then you make some decisions. You may not articulate this claim as saying, well, the reason I'm doing this is to help my students learn. That may be very obvious to you. Okay, let's talk about accountability. Many of the decisions we make on the basis of classroom assessments are high stakes. Passing to the next grade is fairly high stakes, for example. Sometimes classroom assessments are used in conjunction with other assessments to make large-scale or high-stakes assessments, such as high school graduation, university entrance. Okay? Therefore, we need to be ready to be accountable for the uses we make of an assessment. In other words, we need to be prepared to convince stakeholders that the intended uses of our assessment are justified. So whom do we need to convince? All stakeholders. All stakeholders. Stakeholders are anybody or institution, any person who might possibly be affected by the use of the assessment. So who are all the stakeholders? Who's the most important stakeholder of all? Students? No. School administrators? No. Parents? No. Ourselves. We're the developer of the test. We're going to use it. If we're not convinced that that test is fair, we won't be able to convince anybody else. Okay? So if we follow the procedures that we feel comfortable about and feel confident about, then we will feel secure in trying to convince other stakeholders, such as our students, our fellow teachers, school administrators. I don't know what's going on here with this. Parents, guardians, and other stakeholders, okay? I think I have to keep pointing it over there. So, we need to be accountable. How can we do this? Well, in a book that Buzz Palmer and I published a few years ago, we developed this notion of assessment justification. Assessment justification is a process that test developers and test users, that is decision makers, can follow to investigate the extent to which the intended uses of an assessment are justified. It's important to understand how this is worded. We are going to investigate the extent to which the intended uses are justified. We can't prove in any scientific sense. We can't prove that our test is fair. We can't prove that it's justified. What we can do is provide a procedure that will help convince the stakeholders that our assessment is justified. So justification on classroom-based assessments, I would point out, typically the teacher is both the developer and user. Unlike in high-stakes assessments, the test developer might be a testing agency, but the test user might be a school system, okay? So assessment justification includes two interrelated activities. One is to state an assessment use argument that the intended use of our assessment are justified, and I'm going to describe what an assessment use argument is, and providing backing or evidence to support that assessment use argument. So the process of assessment justification is very similar. It's not like a scientific experiment. It's not like scientific research. It's more like the argument that are used by lawyers in a trial. So if you have a trial, one lawyer is going to argue that the person is innocent, and the other lawyer will argue that the person is guilty. And each lawyer will present arguments, and they will provide backing, different kinds of information, witnesses, eyewitness reports, photographs, forensic information. They will present that data to support their argument. And so the process of assessment justification is essentially like that. We lay out an assessment use argument, and we provide backing. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time in this presentation to talk about providing backing. So let's talk about an AUA. An AUA consists of a series of claims. Claims are statements about intended consequences of using assessment, about the decisions to be made, about our intended interpretations, and about assessment records. So in assessment use argument, there are 4 claims, okay? Each claim in an assessment AUA has 2 parts. It has an outcome, that is a consequence, a decision, an interpretation, or assessment record, and it has one or more qualities of the outcome. So we can illustrate this way. When we articulate an AUA, we begin with claim 1. So when we develop a test, we don't begin with what kind of a task should we use or how are we going to score it. We begin by asking, why are we going to give this test? What consequences do we want to bring about? And the quality of the consequences are that they are beneficial. Consequences are beneficial when they help promote good and are not detrimental to stakeholders. Very simple. Okay? Then we say, what decisions do we have to make in order to help promote those beneficial consequences? If we want beneficial consequences to happen, we can't just sit around and hope for them. We have to do something. We have to make a decision. So what decisions will help promote those intended beneficial consequences? And those decisions will be value sensitive and equitable. A decision is value sensitive if it takes into consideration the educational values of the school, the societal values of the community, and it also follows existing rules, regulations, laws, and so forth. Decisions are equitable when students who are at the same level of ability are classified in the same way. If 2 students get the same score in the assessment, and one passes and the other fails, then that decision is not equitable, because it's not made on the basis of the test score, but it's made on the basis of some other information. So then we say, what information do we need to make these decisions? And we say claim 3 about interpretations of test takers' ability. And the qualities of these claims, these interpretations, are that they're meaningful, impartial, generalizable, relevant, and sufficient. And I'll just briefly, meaningful means, an interpretation is meaningful when it provides stakeholders or decision makers with information about the test taker's language ability in terms that they can understand and relate to. Impartiality means that the interpretation is free from bias that may favor or disfavor one group over another. Generalizable if it applies to or extends to the target language use domain. So when we give an assessment, we're not really interested in how students perform on the assessment. We're interested in what that tells us about how well they can use the language outside of the assessment, in the language classroom, typically. Interpretations need to be relevant to the decision to be made. So they're relevant if that information actually helps the decision maker make the decision. And they're sufficient if they provide enough information to make the decision. And then finally, we have assessment records. And the quality of assessment records is that they're consistent. So most assessments may have different aspects of a measurement procedure. They may be administered at different times of day, different days of the week, to different groups of students. The scores that students achieve should be the same, whether they take it on Monday or Wednesday, whether they do it in the morning or the afternoon and so forth, or whether they're scored by one teacher or another teacher. Okay, let me move a little bit to talk about developing classroom-based assessments now. Talk about using an AU guide to guide development of assessment. Then I'll talk about developing assessment task templates. And I'll talk about creating multiple assessment tasks. And all the topics in this part of the talk will be illustrated with an example of a specific classroom-based language assessment. Unfortunately, this example is an English language assessment. I wasn't able to come up with an assessment of Korean, but maybe some of the people who were in my workshop yesterday said they might be able to provide some for me for future. Okay, so here's this example assessment from our book. In our book, we have about 10 fully developed examples, and there's another 5 or 10 on the OUP webpage. So there are lots of examples. There are examples of all 4 skills: listening, speaking, reading, writing. Examples for beginning level, intermediate level, advanced level learners, and examples for elementary, teens, and adults, so all the age levels. Okay. So in this assessment, the test takers are the students in the classroom. The age group, this was designed for teens, so these would be high school students. It's a content-based language learning class. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that notion. It's an approach to teaching language where the language teacher works with a content teacher, and so that the students receive their part of their teaching in the content class in the language to be taught, and the language teacher provides the content of the content class provides the basis for the language teaching, okay? So it's a content-based language learning class. The level, these are advanced learners. The language is EFL or ESL. The assessment task itself is a speaking task where students are given some prompts, and these are based on topics from their social studies class. And they have to look at a prompt, and then they have to provide an answer in speaking. And the intended use is to make summative decisions. This test will be used to decide which students will pass or fail or pass to the next grade. But it's not sufficient by itself. This test will be one of several different tests that are given throughout the school year to make that decision. Okay, let's look at how we can use that assessment use argument now to guide the development of assessment tasks. An AUA provides a rationale and basis for designing and developing classroom-based assessment. We begin the development of language assessment by asking a series of questions that will guide us as we develop assessment. So we start with claim 1 about intended consequences, and the question is, what beneficial consequences do we want to bring about? Or we might rephrase that and say, what good things do we want to help make happen for our students, ourselves, our school, and perhaps other stakeholders? And to answer these questions, we state claim 1 about consequences. So here's claim 1 for the example assessment. The consequences of using the classroom speaking assessment will be beneficial to stakeholders as indicated in the table below. So one intended consequence here is that students who have mastered the learning objectives will benefit by receiving appropriate instruction at the next grade. So they mastered this level, they're ready to be instructed at the next level. And the students are affected, and the teachers in the next level are affected. The other part is the students who have not mastered the course material will benefit from receiving instruction at the same level. Now, they may not simply repeat the course, they may have some remedial instruction, some speaking clinic, or some different activities, okay? And again, the students are the stakeholders who are affected, and the teachers in the same grade or in the current level are the ones who are affected. So that's claim 1. Next question is about claim 2. What decisions do we need to make in order to help promote these beneficial consequences? And so we answer this question by stating claim 3. Claim 2, sorry. Claim 2 for the example sentence. The decisions are made by the teacher at the end of the school year and will affect the stakeholders listed in the table below. So here's the table that illustrates the decisions. The decisions are summative high stakes, and they're deciding which students pass to the next grade. And there's a note that this will be used in combination with other tests given throughout the school year. The teacher will make the decision. It will be made at the end of the school year. And these are the people, the stakeholders who will be affected. Okay? Also part of the claim is to state the qualities. It says the decisions take into consideration the educational values of the school, the societal values of the community, follow the rules and regulations of the school, and are equitable to stakeholders. So the next claim is claim 3 about interpretation. So we ask, what information about our students' language ability do we need in order to make these decisions? And to answer this question, we articulate claim 3. Here's claim 3. The interpretations about students' speaking ability are relevant to the high-stakes summative decision to be made. They're relevant to those decisions, but are not sufficient for those decisions because the scores from other assessments will also be used. They're meaningful with respect to the content of the course and of the current lesson. They're generalizable to the current language class, and they're impartial or free from bias for all students. Then claim 4, the next question is, what kind of assessment record? Is it going to be a description? Is it going to be a score? Is it going to be a grade, a mark? What kind of assessment record will be most appropriate for the intended use of the assessment? And so claim 4, for the example, is that the scores from the speaking assessment, so we said we're going to have scores, and that they are consistent across different times and days of administration, across different administrations to different groups of students, across different prompts and topics. As you will see in this task, each student has a separate prompt. And students' performances are scored consistently by the teacher according to a consistent application of the rating scale. So now let's talk about how we can use the AUA actually to guide the development of assessment tasks. We need to base our assessments on the claims in our AUA, the claims that we've just made, and this assures that the qualities of our claims, beneficial, value-sensitive, meaningful, relevant, all those things, that these qualities are realized in the assessments that we develop. Claim 3 and 4 particularly provide specific information that's relevant to developing assessment tasks. Claim 3 about interpretation defines the area of language ability to be assessed, and it identifies the target language use domain. And the target language domain is any setting outside of the test itself in which the test takers have to use the language. And of course, for classroom-based assessments, the primary target language use domain is the language classroom. These parts of Claim 3 will determine the kinds of assessment tasks we develop. So Claim 3 defines the ability and the TLU domain, and the definition of that ability is derived from the standards or the syllabus, from the teaching materials, from the teaching and learning activities that the teachers use it. So the definition of the ability draws on the content of the course. And the TLU domain is defined as a classroom. It consists of a lot of different tasks. And the characteristics of those class tasks, plus the definition of ability, determine the kind of assessment task we use. Claim 4 about assessment records identifies possible sources of inconsistency, and each kind of test will have different possible sources of inconsistency. This is a speaking test. It's administered individually, and so that one of the sources of consistency would be making sure that the teacher administers the test uniformly to each student. Okay? And the kinds of assessment tasks we use, plus a concern for consistency, will determine the administrative procedures we follow and the scoring method we specify. We also need, of course, to consider the practicality of the assessment tasks. So these are the steps we follow. First, we select a TLU task that engages the ability to be assessed, and it might serve as a basis for developing an assessment task. So the source for deciding what kind of assessment task to use are the tasks that we use in teaching. We base our assessment tasks on teaching tasks. Then we describe that TLU task. We need to describe that in enough detail so that we can then modify it to provide a basis for assessment task template. Now the reason we need to modify the task, TLU task, is because we cannot, it's almost never possible to use a teaching task as is for an assessment task. One reason is that that task has already been used in the classroom, and to give it again on assessment wouldn't give us any additional information about how well a student can apply that ability outside of the assessment. And the second reason is that many of the teaching tasks that we use would not be practical. They might be too long, too complicated, would not be practical to use as assessment tasks. Then step 4 is we develop a method for scoring, recording, or scoring the student's performance. And then finally, we use this assessment task template to develop multiple assessment tasks. So we start with the TLU domain, the classroom. There are all these different tasks, teaching tasks, and we pick one, that we think will be suitable. We describe that, and then we modify that, and then we develop a recording method for that, and that becomes our assessment task template, or a blueprint, if you will, a table of specifications, and that enables us to create multiple assessment tasks. Oh, this is all messed up. Many assessments include more than a single task. So when we give an assessment, usually there's more than one task. We have lots of different tasks. And an assessment task template provides a basis for developing multiple assessment tasks with similar characteristics. When we develop an assessment task template, we specify the ability to be assessed, the task characteristics of the tasks, the administrative procedures we're going to follow, and the method that will be used for scoring students' responses. To create multiple assessment tasks, we create one task, a sort of a model assessment task based on the assessment task template, and then we create different assessment tasks, okay? But we keep the definition of the ability the same because we want multiple tasks that will attest the same ability, and we keep the attributes of the students the same because the participants is one of the characteristics of the task. When we describe a task, we say, who are the participants? In this case, they're teenagers, they're advanced level learners, okay? But what we do is we change one or more of the other characteristics. For example, we might change the topical content. In this example task, you see, each prompt has a slightly different topical content. Or we might change the type of speaking activity. In this task, students have to basically give a monologue. Okay, they're given 5 minutes and they give a brief monologue. But we could change that. We could have two students interacting, talking about the topic. So what we do is we start with our assessment task template, and we develop an assessment task model, a model task, and then that model task becomes a basis for developing other assessment tasks. And this is particularly useful if you have, let's say, a group of teachers who are teaching the same course at the same grade level, but different sections. It enables them to collaborate and use this assessment task template to write different assessment tasks. So let's look at an example assessment task. Each student is given a prompt and an answer sheet for his or her notes. And here's the teacher, what the teacher says. And the teacher says exactly the same thing to each student. Here's the question about a topic that I want you to discuss. And the teacher gives them the notes, one of the prompts, and their note. It says, now take a minute to make notes to guide your discussion. So the student has the prompt and he can make some notes. Now you'll have about 5 minutes to discuss this issue. You begin now. And here are a couple example prompts. I won't read these out, but these are topics that the students will have discussed in their social studies class. And these are topics that, not these exact prompts, but these were issues that would have been also discussed in the ESL class. So those are the prompts. And then here's the scoring rubric, the rating scale. It's an analytic scale, and since this is a content-based class, students are going to rate it on their task achievement and their knowledge of topical information. Now, if this were just a language class, just a speaking class, you might not include those two aspects. But since this is a content-based class, we're interested in how well they can achieve the task and also their knowledge of the content. But we're also going to score them on grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. So on each one of these scales, they're rated on a scale from 1 to 4. Okay? And then this is the recording form that the teacher uses. So you have a column for each one of the levels and rows for each one of the categories. And the teacher writes the number in there, in the box. Now the reason the boxes are that big is not because the teacher writes large, but because these boxes enable the teacher to make notes. These notes can be used for two purposes. One, they might help the teacher arrive at a rating. Suppose a student is sort of in between a 2 and a 3. But the teacher can look at the notes after the student is finished and look at the notes and say, well, based on this, I think I'll give her a 3 instead of a 2. Second is that even though this is used for some of the decisions, there is an opportunity for the teacher to give feedback to the students. So the students actually could receive their rating form and could see what the feedback is. Okay, let me just summarize briefly. Classroom teachers need the knowledge and skills to enable them to develop classroom-based language assessments that they can justify to stakeholders. The process of assessment justification provides a basis for being accountable to stakeholders. An assessment use argument provides an explicit rationale and conceptual framework for justifying the inferential links between assessment performance, scores, interpretations, and assessment use decisions and consequences. An AUA also guides the development and use of classroom-based assessments. By using an AUA, classroom teachers can develop classroom-based language tests that assess the learning objectives of classroom instruction, that generalize the students' target language use domains, that is, to the classroom, that provide information that is useful for making decisions, and that can be justified to stakeholders. By following the assessment development process I've described, the assessment tasks we create should engage the ability to be assessed. They should correspond to TLU tasks, should be free from bias, provide assessment records that are consistent, and be practical to develop, administer, and use. In addition, by following the assessment development process I've described, teachers will interact with their students and colleagues and other stakeholders in the process of developing and using assessments. Assessment will become an essential part, an integral part of teaching and learning. And assessment will be seen by both teachers and students as a valuable and positive aspect of teaching and learning. 감사합니다.